Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to the first History Happy Hour with Lehigh Valley Passport to History. We have a very special guest today, Ted from Historic Bethlehem, but before we get to that, we want to talk a little bit about what this is all about. This is our first one, so bear with us a little bit, but Lehigh Valley Passport to History is a partnership of 28 and growing historic sites and resources in and around Pennsylvania's Lehigh Valley. Oh. We just had a little feedback there. Give me a second. The History Happy Hour series, is what you're watching with a little bit of technical difficulties, is designed to bring the Lehigh Valley history right into the comfort of your living room during these days of continued social distancing. Several days before each event, we'll share the live stream link, which you're watching now, and we'll recommend a drink from a local brewery, which we're getting to in just a second. Tune in now, and we're going to have some questions. If you want to leave them in the comments, we're going to get to them mostly at the end. And without further ado, I want to make sure that I bring in Jeff. You're here from Cave Brewing. Jeff, welcome to the first History Happy Hour. You're the first person on it. How's it going?
Super honored, man. Thank you very much.
So tell us a little bit about what you're doing now. Obviously, there's some news that just came in. I'm going to bring up your website here and just give us a little bit about what you do, Cave Brewing, and what's going on now.
Yeah, we're a nano brewery. People have heard the term micro before, but we're nano, meaning a lot smaller, maybe 1,000 smaller. We're actually located, we do all the brewing in Bethlehem. We're up on South Mountain here.
Okay. And
we're in a garage. And we use our well water 300 feet straight down. And we're slinging in a great market, lots of great beers in the Lehigh Valley. So, for people who love beer, man, this is a special place. And it's, a lot of breweries.
You say you're doing it out of your garage. Was this something how long have you been doing it? Was it something that you started like a lot of people, just kind of home brewing?
Yes and no. Like a lot of people, they're like, oh man, I started home brewing a couple of years. I'm going to quit my job because it sucks. I'm going to drink and brew beer because it's cool. I started in 1989.
Oh, okay.
So
all right.
We actually started the business in 2015. So I was a home brewer for a long, long time. Started out of necessity. I was in Arizona, and in 1989, Arizona wasn't known as the beer capital. So started, I grew up on the East Coast, went to school out there. I was finishing up school. I liked the good beers, couldn't get them.
Sure.
Wife bought me a homebrew kit, and
there you go.
There we went.
Well, listen, we're so happy. I know that Lehigh Valley Passport to History is happy to have you as a sponsor. Thank you for coming on. Your hard part's over. Everybody go to cavebrewing.com. You get to leave and enjoy our talk with Ted.
Awesome.
So thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Cheers.
You too. All right. And now what we're getting to is what everybody's been waiting for, of course. We have Ted Moyer with Historic Bethlehem Museums and Sites. I'm going to make sure that he can introduce himself. So I'm going to bring the man in himself. Ted.
Good evening.
Can you hear me, Ted?
Yes, I can.
Good evening, Ted. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well.
So before we get into your presentation that I know a lot of people are looking forward to, can you tell people a little bit about yourself and maybe why you're so interested in local history?
Well, I grew up in Bethlehem, and I went to Liberty High School, went to college. I was a history education major, secondary ed. Time I graduated, there was about 200 applicants for every position. So despite my efforts, I didn't get a teaching job, spent 40 years in retail management. And when I retired in 2013, I became a volunteer for Historic Bethlehem Museums and Sites out at Burnside Plantation, one of our sites, initially and then I came into town in 2015 to start doing tours as a docent or a tour guide or a historical interpreter, some people refer them as.
So people know you from being downtown because you're dressed like you are now. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But people will see you dressed in downtown Bethlehem wearing some of that period appropriate clothing.
That's right. And it's a little bit unusual for me because I always stop in at Wawa on my way into Bethlehem in my costume garb, and people are always asking me questions about that. I always tell them this is something that my wife prefers that I wear every day.
I think it's a little bit better than a business card, right? People are asking you why you're dressed like that. I think it's great.
Yes.
So we're already at 5:35. I don't want to take up all the time for your presentation, so I'd like to just get into it. Let me move some things around here a little bit, and I'm going to make sure that you are featured. I might have to move this around. Okay. So, John, I know that you have a presentation planned. I'm going to let you do most of the talking, but I am going to ask you a couple questions. And the first one, a part of your presentation, deals with Johann Sebastian Goundie. He became an influential person in Moravian Bethlehem, and obviously the city's history. So what can you tell us about his background and what brought him to the city of Bethlehem?
Well, Mr. Goundie was very important to the town of Bethlehem. A lot of people really don't know much about Mr. Goundie. Mr. Goundie was born on the 27th of November, 1773 in Oftersheim, Germany, which is outside of Baden. And he was one of 14 children, the ninth of 14 children. So both his mothers, he had two mothers, a stepmother and a mother. Both of them were very busy bearing children. His name was originally Gunt, G-U-N-D-T, a very German sounding name. So he was anxious to get out of the house. I'm sure his parents were anxious to get him out of the house as well, to eliminate one mouth to feed. So as a young man, he actually was interested in becoming part of the military, and he joined the cavalry, where he realized pretty quickly that that was not his calling. So at the age of 22, in 1795, he left the military and joined what is now the Moravian Church. And he also took up training as a brewmaster. He had an apprenticeship in Neuwied, which is a town outside of Baden in Germany, and he completed that. The competition for brewmasters in Germany was pretty severe, so in 1802, he took a job to run the brewery operations for the Moravian Church community of Salem, North Carolina. So he made the journey over across the Atlantic over here to what at that time was the brand new United States of America. On his way down to Salem, North Carolina, he stopped here in Bethlehem, also a Moravian church-run community, and they were looking for a brewmaster to take over their brewing operations, which they were really having a difficult time making profitable. He declined that offer, honored his contract, and went to Salem, North Carolina. Down there, he had a difficult time convincing the elders of the church how to run the brewery to make it profitable. So after only about 6 months, he gave up on that expedition and decided to return to Germany. On his way back to Germany, he again stopped in Bethlehem. They were still looking for somebody to take over their brewing operations. And he negotiated a contract with them that involved him brewing beer, but also large quantities of spirits, particularly brandy. He was interested in brewing brandy, distilling brandy, and serving it to the community, but the church did not want him serving it in small portions because they were concerned about people overusing brandy. So he negotiated a contract where he could make beer and only commercial quantities of brandy. Took a 6-month contract in 1803, and he died here in 1852. So he lasted way more than his 6-month contract.
Yeah, I guess you could say that, to say the least. And we're moving on to question 2. Let me get this bottom question out of here. Okay. So you're wearing, we talked about this, you just walked into Wawa and people are asking you about the attire that you're wearing. Of course, I would. What are you wearing? Can you tell me some of the attire? And is this the way that Mr. Goundie would have dressed at that time? We're going to show some more pictures later, but you can kind of get the idea and also the photo behind you.
Yes, well, we're in Mr. Goundie's office here doing this video from. And when Mr. Goundie started brewing here in 1803 at 29 years old, this is what he probably would have looked like when he was working in his brewery, but not necessarily doing physical work. So this is business casual, 1803. He's wearing a buttonless shirt, a waistcoat, breeches, leggings, buckle shoes, and when he would be outside, he would wear a hat. I'm wearing it today for effect inside, but typically Mr. Goundie would wear that outside. And when he was working, he would have sleeves rolled up and obviously an apron on or something to protect his clothing as well.
Okay, we actually just had a question come in, and this is fun. We can bring it on screen, but this goes along with number 3 that we have. Many people find it surprising that Moravians consumed alcohol. We have this idea that they're very pious and whatnot. What can you tell us about that? What was the church's position on that?
Well, let me set the stage in terms of the environment that Mr. Goundie was walking into when he took the job here in Bethlehem in 1803. The Moravians, as we know today, were actually followers of a man named Jan Hus, originally in the 1380s. This is in Prague in the Czech Republic. So they're one of the oldest Protestant groups in the world. And after Jan Hus's execution by the Catholic Church for heresy in 1415, burned at the stake, his followers went underground to avoid persecution. The church continued to stay after the brethren, as they called themselves. In 1457, they called themselves the Unitas Fratrum, or United Brethren. Several decades and even centuries of persecution by the church forced them to flee out of their homes in Moravia, hence the Moravians, and Bohemia, into Silesia, which is now part of Poland in the 1620s. And then eventually they were offered sanctuary on the estate of a Saxon nobleman by the name of Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf. And von Zinzendorf was a Lutheran, but he was really interested in supporting Protestant splinter groups. He invited the brethren on his estate in 1722. They established a little community there called Herrnhut, and the numbers grew, and eventually, with his money and backing after he joined the church himself, Zinzendorf was able to send missionaries out to different parts of the world. 1735, they go to Savannah, Georgia. Eventually, 1740, making their way to Nazareth, Pennsylvania. And then in 1741, they bought 500 acres of land here in what is the heart of the town of Bethlehem. That's about 1 square mile, and they paid 450 pounds of good Pennsylvania currency for that, which today is about 85,000 US dollars. And in that 500 acres, the church was the dominant factor. The church funded the purchase. They owned everything. They controlled the community. If you did not belong to the church, you could not own a piece of property or a business within the 500 acres. If you wanted to build a home there or construct a business trade building, you had to lease the land from the church, or you could borrow the money for the supplies to build it from the church as well. That closed community lasted until 1844. Eventually, it became part of the borough of North Bethlehem. So when Mr. Goundie got here, he had to negotiate things with the church elders.
All right. Well, moving on, we're talking about Goundie. We haven't maybe talked about what made him such a special man that we remember. So what made Mr. Goundie such a successful business, and why do we remember him today? What did he do in that room that you're sitting in?
Well, this was his home. I'm going to refer to that a little bit later, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the question earlier about the drinking by the Moravians. And the Moravians had become part of the German culture in their stay in Saxony, and they brought that tradition of drinking with them. And for many, many centuries in Europe, the water was polluted, and even well water was not something that you really could drink safely. So it became a tradition to drink alcoholic beverages because the alcohol kills some of the bacteria. So the Moravians, the brethren, adopted that culture as well as the German language when they came over here, and pretty much everybody drank alcohol. One of the reasons they purchased this property here was that it was a spring here that was producing 1 million gallons of fresh drinking water per day. So they had a great water source. They didn't have to drink water out of the Monocacy Creek, the adjacent Monocacy Creek, or the Lehigh River. They used the spring for drinking water, but they still brewed and drank a lot of beer. So a brewmaster was a very important part of any community. Even the children drank beer. The alcohol level would vary depending on what you wanted to use the purpose for, and they would use a higher alcohol content for celebrations, You might give the children a little bed draft if you want to have them take a nice nap, or you might have a nice bed draft for yourself of a higher alcohol content before you went to sleep in order to overcome the aches and pains that you had from your work, your hard physical work during the day. And of course, when you had a wedding, you might have a bride's ale. When you're traveling on the really rough, rocky roads with a coach without suspension, and you wanted to make your journey a little bit more pleasurable, you drink a traveling ale, which was a very high alcohol content, which might help you fall asleep during that travel and make your journey a little bit more pleasant. So that was the environment that Mr. Goundie came into in terms of being a brewmaster and made a very important part of the community. The Moravians actually had a brewery here. The first brewery in the Lehigh Valley started in 1749 out in Nazareth, Pennsylvania. It was called Christian's Brunn Brewery. That means Christian Spring. Was named after Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf's son, Christian. And that was closed in 1796 because the elders of the church would frequently visit, surprise visits to the brewery, and they would find that the employees were partaking a little bit too much of their wares. So they were drunk when they would come out here, and the church decided, well, we can't have this. So they closed it in 1796 due to intemperance. And they moved the brewery here in 1783 into Bethlehem, called it the Single Brothers Brewery, which was located at the end of Main Street behind the Single Brothers house here. And that was the brewery that Mr. Goundie took over when he came here in 1803.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I got a little bit ahead of myself there. We're talking about his business acumen. But I guess that ties in with being a brewer, does it not? Having, what are some of the attributes that Goundie had that made him so successful in the city and elsewhere?
Well, Mr. Goundie was a very ambitious man. He was a great negotiator. And he became very valuable to the community here because he was able to make the brewery operation profitable. So the church got a piece of that profit. And so he would often use the threat of leaving as a negotiating tool with the church. And every time he didn't get what he wanted, he would throw up, well, I'm going back to Germany. And the church would often relent to him and give in. He was able to negotiate a lot of things. He also got involved in other businesses. So he was a man that was interested in moving things forward in Bethlehem and keeping Bethlehem moving along with the rest of the country. He owned a plastering business, and he also owned a dry goods store, which opened up in 1825 next to his home here, which is now the visitor center, where the visitor center is located on Main Street. He also was involved in banking and in real estate. He turned his dry goods business over to his son, his oldest son, George Heinrich. And George Heinrich eventually became a diplomat for the Buchanan administration, and he was a representative of the United States government to Switzerland, so he spent most of his time in Europe. And Mr. Goundie then turned the building over, the dry goods, to his son-in-law, the husband of his eldest daughter, Maria Cornelia, and eventually turned the brewing operation over to his stepson, Abraham Andreas. And in 1834, Mr. Goundie was considered to be so successful that he considered himself a gentleman. So he got out of the day-to-day micromanaging of the businesses, and he decided, well, Gund doesn't sound like the name of a gentleman. I think we need to have a better name that represents my success in business. And in 1834, he changed his name legally to Goundie. His stepbrother, also to the Lehigh Valley, was also in the brewing business, and he changed his name to Goundie at the same time. So both Gunds became Goundies in 1834.
With so much success, how did his ambition and forward-thinking attitude lead to conflicts with the church? I would imagine there has to be some of that if you have a person who's, maybe being so ambitious that it might go outside of the area. How did that work out?
He had a number of conflicts with the church over how they made decisions here in Bethlehem. Again, remember, the church elders were doing all the deciding here, and they were called the Aufseher Collegium, or the overseeing body. And in 1804, Mr. Goundie was again considering going back to Germany. And he went to the church elders and said, I kind of like Bethlehem, I'll stay if you allow me to get married. And the church made marital decisions for you, and they would pick prospective spouses for you as well. So in the process of trying to determine who he should marry, the church declined his first 5 picks. Now, they also had a system that allowed the Lord to get involved in this process. It was called the lot system. And the lot system involved putting 3 pieces of paper into a vessel of some kind, yes, no, and ask later, which was typically 6 months. And you would draw out one of those pieces of paper to answer your question. And the church elders used that to answer questions about business, to answer questions about marriages, to answer questions about the community and how the church should be run. Mr. Goundie was turned down several times by the lot when he picked out a prospective spouse. So he wasn't very happy about that. And eventually, number 6 became the winner. He settled on the lovely Cornelia Elizabeth Wagner Andreas. There she is. And she was a widow. She had married Heinrich Andreas at the age of 16 years old and had borne him a child. He died in 1802, so she was 24 years old in 1804 when she married Mr. Goundie. They had 6 children of their own that they raised in Mr. Goundie's home here in Bethlehem. Another incident involving Mr. Goundie and his run-in with the church elders takes place around 1810 when Mr. Goundie again is considering leaving, but he wants to stay if they allow him to build his own house. Well, the church elders were very particular about who they allowed to build homes here in Bethlehem at that time in the 500 acres. And Mr. Goundie was not granted permission to build his own house. Now, he had been turned down by the lot for several pieces of property he wanted to purchase as well. The lot said, sorry, Mr. Goundie, no, the Lord won't agree to that. So he was a little bit disturbed by that. And he wanted to have an agreement where he could purchase a home and not put the question to the lot system. Well, the elders would not go for that. So Mr. Goundie circumvented that, made a deal with a man by the name of George Huber, who was already a granted landowner, and Mr. Huber agreed to build him a house. And in 1810, Mr. Huber started construction on the home that we're in right now to do this video, Mr. Goundie's house here on Main Street. And in 1811, Mr. Goundie and his family moved in to his new home, leasing the land from the church. And he leased the land that the house sits on from the church all the way until a month before his death in April of 1852, when he was able to purchase the land for $70. And he sold the house shortly thereafter for $5,070. So he got his $70 back that he had to pay for the land from the church. Another incident involving him and clashing with the church takes place in 1817. He had had a pretty good standing in the community here, and because of that, he was really well respected. So the church actually named him the representative of the Bethlehem church community here to a synod being held in Herrnhut, which was the worldwide center of the Moravian church. And he went over there in 1817, got a chance to visit his ailing father and his family members. And when he came back in 1819, he brought back several of his cousins and a woman who was not a family member, he brought back to be a domestic servant in his house here. Well, it was a total scandal in the Moravian community at that time to have a single woman unrelated to you living in your house. She's supposed to live in the single sisters choir building. The community was divided up into choirs by your marital status, and single women typically lived with other single women. Mr. Goundie was really violating the church conflict, problem had a conflict with the church because of that in 1819 when he came back here from Bethlehem. He was a proponent of the lot being removed. So in the synod where he was at in 1818, they voted to make the lot system optional. So he came back to Bethlehem, pretty proud of himself, announced that, hey, guess what? We're allowed to make the lot system optional. And there was a referendum here, and the church community decided to make the lot optional, which Mr. Goundie was very pleased to have happen. So he was a proponent of moving Bethlehem forward. He was an advocate for pushing through the Lehigh Canal, which really brought the Industrial Revolution to Bethlehem. Many of the church conservatives were opposed to that. He had to fight for that to get that to happen. And then he was, because of his banking interest, he really was an important person in guiding the finances of the church through the 1837 to 1841 banking crash here in the United States and bringing Bethlehem into the Industrial Revolution. Eventually, it's the founding of Bethlehem Iron on the south side and leading the community into becoming a secular community. In 1844, he was a big advocate for saying we need to have this church control of the area abandoned, and he convinced the church to hold a referendum, and the community members within the 500 acres voted to become part of the borough of North Bethlehem, which had grown up around the 500 acres in 1845, and the closed community ended, partly because of Mr. Goundie's urgings.
The more I learn about him, the more I like him. He seems a little bit like somebody who, while he had, was a very successful professional person, was also pushing the boundaries a little bit in terms of trying to get the city to expand and look at new things. Is that kind of on path?
Absolutely. And, despite his conflicts with the church, you couldn't argue with success. Mr. Goundie was very successful, so much so that they made him the fire inspector in 1820. And in 1827, they made him the mayor of the Moravian community here in Bethlehem. So this is done by the church elders. This is typically where we have a vote on this. This is something the church elders decided, but they did respect his business acumen and his organizational skills, and he actually made him the mayor in 1827.
Okay, so I'm going to switch. I have two more questions. I'm going to switch them up, though, because I want to kind of finish talking about Mr. Goundie before we go to the World Heritage topic. So I'm more interested, and I have been in the Goundie house this week. So how can anybody find out more about Mr. Goundie, the Goundie house, and learn more?
Well, you can visit the Goundie house here next to the Visitor Center at 501 Main Street, where Main and Market meet. You can go to historicbethlehem.org, and you can find out about the tours that we do. We do 10 different walking tours here on the north side of town. We also do a tour on the south side of town. There isn't a whole lot of information online about Mr. Goundie because of the nature of the community here in Bethlehem and the fact that they kept their business to themselves. There isn't a lot of general information out there that you can find out about him, particularly about his personal life as well, which is a lot of people have an interest in finding out what kind of a guy was this guy. You really don't find out a lot about that. But on our website, you can find out about when you can see the home, when you can visit his house, when you can get a tour that will tell you a little bit about his home as well. And we have 20 different sites that Historic Bethlehem sponsors and maintains here in Bethlehem as well. So if you go to historicbethlehem.org or call 1-800-TOURS, stop in at the Visitor Center here on Main Street, the Cameron Museum up on New Street, or the Moravian Museum on Church Street when they're open, you can get some information about the tours that we do. And also you can find out about membership opportunities, which allows you to have access to information before the general public does. And you get access to a lot of different events that are happening. Some of them are not even open to the public, that you get as exclusivity as a member as well. I see something scrolling on about the website.
All right, can you hear me? Sorry about that.
Yes.
Okay, before we finish up here, I wanted to ask you one more question. This is not about Mr. Goundie, but it is about Bethlehem being on the short list for the nomination to become a World Heritage Site. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Yes. Bethlehem is on the short list to be nominated to become a World Heritage Site, and that's a very high-level recognition. There are only 25 World Heritage Sites in the United States. The Statue of Liberty, the Grand Canyon, many of the national parks. There's only one national heritage site World Heritage Site in Pennsylvania right now, and that's Independence Hall in Philadelphia. So to be in that lofty company would be a real honor for historic Bethlehem and for the whole city of Bethlehem as well.
Okay, I'm gonna bring. All right. Let me just figure this out for a second. Okay, Ted, thank you so much. And thank you for being our first guest and for bearing with some technical difficulties and taking the time to learn some new software today. I appreciate it. It's kind of like where history is coming full circle here. We're live for everyone to learn about it on Facebook. Who would have thought it?
Yes, well, thank you for having me. I did want to mention quickly about the upcoming Blueberry Festival that Historic Bethlehem is holding. The next 2 weekends, the 18th and 19th and 25th and 26th, out at our site at Burnside Plantation. We also have Blueberry to Go, which you can pre-order some delicious blueberry treats. You can stop at those weekends to see myself. I'll be out there at the Johnson Barn giving tours and information about Burnside Plantation, the first private residence in the town of Bethlehem, 1748. And also you can get garden tours out there from the volunteers who maintain the garden out there. So it's a great opportunity to learn history, get some delicious food, have a little bit of fun, stop out at Burnside Plantation.
All right, Ted, thank you again so much. And I want to be sure to give a big thank you to Cave Brewing. We had Jeff on earlier. This is new. We just started. We talked about this a week or two ago, and to be able to have this come to fruition so quickly is fantastic. I really want to say thank you again to Lehigh Valley Passport. For Historic Happy Hour with Lehigh Valley Passport to History. It's a partnership of 28 and growing historic sites and resources in and around Pennsylvania's Lehigh and Northampton counties. Learn more about them at lvhistory.org. And thank you so much for people who are watching. This has been a lot of fun, and I think next week we're going to have even more fun. So tune back again next Thursday at 5:30. Ted, again, thank you so much. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say before we go.
Well, I did want to let the folks know that if you want to visit Mr. Goundie himself right now, he resides in God's Acre Cemetery.
Oh, yeah.
In Bethlehem. It's on the campus of Moravian Academy. And if you go over to visit the cemetery, Mr. Goundie lies in the married men's section of the cemetery. There's his tombstone there. Mr. Goundie is buried with all the married men because the Moravians buried their church members by the choir system. So married men were buried with married men and married women were buried with married women. You didn't spend eternity next to your spouse and a community where you had arranged marriages and no divorce. They were probably fine with that. Mr. Goundie Stone says, Sebastian Goundie, though, you won't see Johann there because the Germans were typically taking and using their middle name frequently. So you can visit his stone in the 3rd row up the 16th stone over and greet Mr. Goundie.
No, and that's fascinating. The acre there is so fascinating to go through and see how many people who are buried there. I know that the Shoup, the Indian chief who was the inspiration for the Last Mohicans, is buried there as well. So, I mean, I guess that's another talk.
Yes, we do a great tour called Death and Dying, which you can look up on the website, and we visit a number of the graves in there. Shoup was one of them. And you can learn all about Shoup and his life and a lot about the Native Americans that are buried in that cemetery, Revolutionary War soldiers that are buried in that cemetery, and a lot of the Moravians who came here had amazing lives, and they're all buried in that cemetery. And to learn their secrets, take the Death and Dying tour.
Will do. Ted, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who watched. And please tune in again next Thursday at 5:30 on the same page, the Lehigh Valley Passport to History page. I'm George Wacker with Lehigh Valley with Love Media. This has been a pleasure. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Take care.